This episode contains discussions of colonialism, torture, execution, physical abuse of children, political abuse, and religious extremism and abuse. If any of these topics is a trigger for you, this might be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. This episode is a sort of prequel for the upcoming two-part episode on the Salem Witch trials, which occurred between February 1692 and May 1693. The trials are only the tip of the iceberg. The town of Salem was a powder keg waiting for a spark. I wanted to give a little more context surrounding the trials, especially the social settings. The topic hits differently when you know the gritty social details. I'd like to give some historical, sociological, and psychological context before getting into the web of social relationships between those accused of witchcraft and their accusers, known as the Afflicted. I'll go into more detail on the trial and the other people involved in the upcoming episode. The original town of Salem was a coastal city in what is now Essex County, Massachusetts. Settlement by Europeans began in 1626 and involved strife between the English colonists and the indigenous peoples. Native Americans had lived in the area for thousands of years before European colonization, and like many colonial situations, contact with Europeans was disastrous for them. In 1686, the indigenous peoples began to fight back, targeting English settlements along the coast. Between 1689 and 1692, attacks were so frequent and bloody that many English settlements along the coast of Maine were abandoned, resulting in a flood of refugees into areas like Essex County. The people of Salem would have been anxious not only about the attacks by indigenous peoples, but also newcomers crowding into their small town. Salem itself was known at the time for its tense social environment. Salem Village, which is present-day Danvers, had many disputes with Salem Town, which is present-day Salem, and the surrounding towns. The main disputes involved property lines and church privileges. The disputes about church privileges were the most heated in the 1690s. This is because the area was settled by religious refugees who sought to build a society according to their own Puritan beliefs. Puritans were considered religious extremists, believing that most humans were born sinners and deserved damnation. Only a select few, known as the elect, were chosen by God to be saved. The rest had to fight for their salvation through a process called conversion, which involved introspection, Bible study, listening to sermons, self-restraint, humiliation, and penitence. Once the person accepted that salvation was only possible due to divine mercy, given for living the Puritan lifestyle, they would be considered born again as part of the elect. These values formed the basis for New England society, including in Salem. In 1672, the people of Salem Village voted to hire their own minister, as it was a long way to travel to Salem Town for church. The first two ministers Salem Village hired stayed only a few years due to underpayment and strife within the community. The third choice was Reverend Samuel Parris. He was hired on June 18, 1689, despite controversy over the matter. On October 10, 1689, the villagers raised his pay and gave him a parsonage and 2 acres of land. This conflicted with a 1681 village resolution against giving church lands or property to anyone. Reverend Paris increased village divisions by regularly seeking out, quote, iniquitous behavior, end quote, among his congregation and making church members perform public penance for small infractions. Tensions rose and bickering increased. In October of 1691, 1 year before the Salem Witch accusations began, a new charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which had grown in size and was now called the Province of Massachusetts Bay, was approved in England. Reverend Increase Mather, a Puritan clergyman and politician, had been working on the charter for 4 years with William Phips, an adventurer who had previously helped Mather oust his political adversary. As part of Mather's charter, Phips was appointed governor of Boston. Mather also handpicked most of the members of the council. One of the first acts of the new government was nominating county justices of the peace and sheriffs and commissioning a special court of oyer and terminer, an older name for criminal court. This assured that the laws were written and upheld by people with Puritan values. Puritans believed that women were more susceptible to attacks from the devil. Every day they were thought to fight against attempts by the devil to overtake them. It was also believed that while men and women were equal in the eyes of God, they were not equal in the eyes of the devil. Women's weak and vulnerable bodies couldn't protect their easily corrupted souls. It's because of this belief that women were often more likely to be accused of witchcraft and to confess to it. Many Puritan women truly believed they had given in to the devil. It's also likely that admission of guilt was the root of least resistance, as those who confessed were often forgiven, served penitence, and reintegrated back into society. Women who didn't conform to Puritan societal norms were the biggest targets of witchcraft accusations, especially unmarried or childless women. Disagreements and feuds with neighbors often resulted in accusations, but most of the time the accusations were dismissed. That is until February of 1692. The story goes that Reverend Paris's 9-year-old daughter, Betty Paris, and her 11-year-old cousin, Abigail Williams, were caught playing at fortune-telling, which today seems like an ordinary thing that young people do. They were trying to predict who their future husbands might be by dropping an egg into a glass of water or onto a mirror and interpreting its shape. The story goes that Tituba, an enslaved woman who worked in Paris's household, had taught the girls this trick. In Puritan culture, fortune-telling was regarded as a demonic activity, and it was after being caught participating in fortune-telling that both girls began to act strangely. Though this version of events is taken as history, there's no documentation of any sort of group fortune-telling in Paris's household, nor any evidence that Tituba had taught them. Reverend Hale of nearby Beverly Village mentioned in his 1702 work, A Modest Enquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft, that one of the afflicted girls had experimented with fortune-telling but didn't give her name. Betty Paris struggled with the idea that she was predestined for damnation. The economic uncertainty her family faced may have spurred her interest in fortune-telling, trying to see what future she might have. Her symptoms, or manifestations as they're called in witchcraft and possession cases, began in January. She became forgetful, unable to focus, and constantly preoccupied. When her father rebuked her, she barked like a dog and occasionally screamed and threw things. After these incidents, she sobbed that she was damned. Abigail Williams lived with the Paris family, a niece of Reverend Paris. Although it was an ordinary practice for young girls to live with relatives to learn about housewifery, we know very little about Abigail, including where she was born and who her parents were. Betty and Abigail's manifestations were described as fits. The girls screamed, threw things, uttered strange sounds, crawled under furniture, and contorted themselves into peculiar positions. Sometimes they went completely still or choked on every word. Reverend Paris called Reverend Hale and other local reverends to pray and fast for the girls. When their strange behavior continued, Paris summoned the village physician, Dr. William Griggs, to examine them. Dr. Griggs found no evidence of physical ailment and proclaimed that the girls were under the influence of, quote, an evil hand, end quote, meaning witchcraft. This isn't unusual, as medicine was still at the four humors and hysteria stage. However, due to the Puritan values of the area, disease and affliction were more often attributed to God or the devil. Other young women in the village began to exhibit similar behaviors. 12-year-old Anne Putnam Jr. and Elizabeth Hubbard both suffered fits and complained of phantom pains. Anne Putnam Jr. was the daughter of one of the most affluent and powerful families in Salem, the Putnams. Her father was a highly influential church member, meaning he was involved in a lot of politics as well. He was very close to Reverend Parris. 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard lived with her aunt and uncle, Rachel and William Griggs. Dr. Griggs was the only physician in the village and had taken in the orphaned Elizabeth, not as a daughter but as a maid. They had recently moved to Salem Village. Compared with the Parrises and Putnams, Hubbard had little family or economic support and faced an uncertain future as an orphaned domestic servant. Most historians believe that in the early days of the witch craze, a social factor may have been at play. The so-called afflicted girls were all from families that were involved in a vicious rivalry between the Putnam and Porter families. The situation had deeply polarized everyone in Salem Village prior to the onset of the fits. The Putnams were farmers, conservative and traditional. The Porters were a bit more liberal in terms of politics and religion, and had just begun branching into maritime trade in the adjacent Salem town. The two families had previously disputed over land, but the real trouble began with the instatement of Reverend Parris in 1689. The Putnams and their allies had supported Reverend Parris, who was conservative like them and didn't tolerate unorthodox views on religion. The Porters had objected, and just months before the fits began, the Porters and their allies had managed to influence local politics to cut Parris's salary. Betty and Abigail were caught playing at witchcraft by her father, and in their fear and panic, they began having fits. After Dr. Griggs proclaimed they were bewitched, other girls began exhibiting symptoms. It's unknown if the rivalry instigated the behaviors, but both sides took advantage of the situation. One of the loudest of the afflicted girls was Anne Putnam Jr. Before long, the afflicted girls started naming people in Salem as witches. The accused included people who had wronged the Putnams and people who were against Reverend Parris. Accusations from allegedly bewitched children weren't enough to begin official investigations, however. Written complaints had to be registered with the magistrates for the accused to be questioned and/or imprisoned. Before the panic spread beyond Salem Village, most of the written complaints were lodged by the brothers Thomas and John Putnam. Some historians wonder to what degree the girls might have been coached or led by their parents on who to accuse. The Porters and their allies were skeptical and tried to find a reasonable, natural explanation for the girls' behavior, which resulted in many of them being accused. The situation then snowballed, becoming much bigger than Putnams versus Porters. Elizabeth Hubbard's early involvement is somewhat of a mystery. She wasn't part of the feud, but her uncle, Dr. Griggs, did tend to the afflicted girls. She likely knew the symptoms, and whether by her own will or not, she began to exhibit them. Historian Carol Carlson has argued that Hubbard and some of the other afflicted girls in similar uncertain circumstances, such as Abigail, may have wanted to draw the attention of the community to their plight. Young girls in Puritan society were undervalued, and perhaps these girls craved attention and agency. Not everyone believed them, an opinion that often resulted in an accusation. Whether they were plotting or actually suffering some sort of mass psychogenic event, the majority of the villagers believed the girls were under the influence of witches, who were the minions of the devil. The first people to be accused by name were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Sarah Good was a 46-year-old homeless woman with a surly reputation. She had been left without prospects after her father took his own life. She married, but her husband died soon after, leaving his debts to her. She remarried, but her relationship with her new husband was turbulent and often violent. She became a beggar and was known as a scold, often publicly chastising both those who gave her alms and those who didn't. She often muttered angrily under her breath and didn't attend church. Even before the accusations and the trials, she was judged by the village as a challenge to Puritan values. Sarah Osborne was a 49-year-old woman who had been married to the brother-in-law of one of the Putnams. He had died, leaving his fortune to her and her children. Sarah hired an Irish immigrant, Alexander Osborne, to help her around the 150-acre farm. Once he paid off his indenture, the two married. The village was shocked when she disregarded her deceased husband's will and took over the farm with Osborne instead of passing it to her oldest children. A legal battle with her children ensued over the estate, which had previously been managed by the Putnams. She also hadn't attended church in years. Tituba was an enslaved woman. Because the records are scarce and also haphazard, it's unknown exactly what Tituba's origins were or her life was before she was purchased by Samuel Parris in 1680. It's likely that she was an indigenous person from South America or the Caribbean. It's likely she worked the sugarcane fields of Barbados for over 10 years, learning to speak some English before Parris bought her. Tituba is the name Parris wrote down, but it probably wasn't her real name. What is known is that she accompanied Parris when he moved to Boston, married and had 2 children. When the family moved to Salem, Tituba went with them, and she stood out as there were few enslaved people or people of color in the area. It's likely she was targeted because of her ethnic differences. On March 1st, 1692, these 3 women were brought before the local magistrates on the complaint of witchcraft. They were interrogated for several days, during which Tituba confessed to signing the Devil's Book, indicating she was a witch. She claimed that Good and Osborne were her accomplices. Osborne proclaimed her innocence and refused to name anyone else. Good didn't confess, but accused Osborne of afflicting the girls. All 3 women were sent to jail. These 3 women fit the stereotypical mold of women who, throughout history, were often accused of being witches. They were social outcasts, acting in ways that were seen as against the natural order. Under pressure from Reverend Parris, the Afflicted accused Martha Corey, Dorothy or Dorcas Good, the 4-year-old child of Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, and Rachel Clinton from nearby Ipswich. Martha Corey was a new but accepted and upstanding member of the Salem Village Church, but her history was not so pure. Over 20 years earlier, Corey had birthed an illegitimate son, who still lived with her and her husband, Giles. Salem town and village were aware of her past, which may have led to her accusation. Corey had also expressed doubt over the credibility of the girls' accusations, the judges hearing the case, and even the existence of witches. In terms of the Putnam-Porter feud, the Putnams could have been demonstrating that open questioning of their good Puritan authority would result in punishment by way of accusation. Dorothy Good was accused of spectral torment, that is, sending an apparition of herself to pinch, poke, and otherwise harm the afflicted girls. What she said during her examination was taken as a confession and implicated her mother as well. Having a 4-year-old child myself, I am shocked. 4-year-olds say whatever gives them joy, gets them treats, or keeps them out of trouble, and most modern adults understand that. However, Puritan children were treated as miniature adults who understood Puritan religious principles. They were also thought to be more easily influenced by the devil. As children, they were more likely to believe they were bewitched, having grown up in a culture which relentlessly required them to confront their sinfulness and the possibility of going to hell. This ingrained doctrine, plus normal childhood fears surrounding punishment and authority, would combine to convince the child that they were in league with the devil. Rebecca Nurse was a 70-year-old woman who was well respected in the community. Many friends, neighbors, and family members publicly testified to her innocence. The charges against her deeply troubled the community. If such an upstanding person could be a witch, anybody could be. In terms of the feud, the Putnams were embroiled in a bitter land dispute with Nurse's family, so her accusation may have been a play to take that land from her. Rachel Clinton fit the stereotypical mold of an accused witch. She was a destitute older woman who had sought divorce from her husband after having an affair. She was forced to beg in the street, and many people suspected her of witchcraft based on that alone. Sometime in March, Mary Ann Warren, who was about 20 and worked as a servant in the home and tavern of Elizabeth and John Proctor, began to exhibit the same strange behavior as the other afflicted girls. She was an orphan, and though of marrying age, she had few prospects other than being a servant for the rest of her life. The Proctors had little sympathy for her fits, and she apparently recovered after John Proctor, who was critical of the witch accusations, had threatened to beat her. She was questioned about her recovery, and her answers were taken as an admission of faking it, which reflected poorly on all the afflicted girls. During Mary Ann's examination, the afflicted fell into fits and accused Mary Ann of witchcraft. She too went into a fit and pled guilty. She later rejoined the ranks of the accusers and testified against John Proctor, whom she claimed had tricked her into signing the Devil's Book. Mercy Lewis, a 19-year-old servant in the home of Thomas and Ann Putnam, began having fits as well. Mercy had survived a Native American raid that had killed her entire family. She'd briefly worked as a maid for Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, before working for the Putnams. She claimed she was visited by spectral creatures, naming Elizabeth Proctor as their master. Being a servant as well, she and Mary Ann may have been friends, but it was certain that the Putnams were at odds with the Proctors, who didn't get on with Reverend Paris. Mary Walcott, the 16-year-old step-cousin of Ann Putnam Jr., joined the afflicted near the end of March. Mary was the daughter of Captain Jonathan Walcott, leader of the Salem Village militia, and was related to the Putnams by marriage. The Walcotts lived next door to the Parises. Mary claimed to see numerous visions and to suffer fits at the hands of the accused witches. During April, word spread around the area about the afflicted girls. There were skeptics of the whole situation. More than 50 men in Ipswich, Topsfield, and Salem town signed a declaration stating that they didn't believe in witches and that spectral evidence was not evidence of witchcraft. Spectral evidence is evidence based on the dreams and visions of the afflicted girls. It was a testimony entered into the court record by witnesses who testified that a specter or spirit came to them in a dream and caused harm to them. In this case, those spirits took the form of the people the afflicted girls accused as witches. Supporters of spectral evidence said the devil needed permission to use a person's form, making them complicit in these attacks. Opponents claimed that the devil could use anyone's form without permission, so the form the spirits took couldn't be used as evidence. Those who didn't believe in witches at all were shunned by Puritans, because casting doubt on the reality of spirits, and in turn the devil, meant doubting the existence of God as well. Because of this, the skeptics were in the minority. More accusations were hurled around Salem Village, Salem Town, and the neighboring towns. Sarah Cloyce spoke out in defense of her sister Rebecca Nurse and found herself accused of witchcraft. Mercy Lewis claimed that Giles Corey, Martha Corey's husband, had appeared to her and forced her to sign the Devil's Book. Bridget Bishop, Deliverance Hobbs and her husband William, and their daughter Abigail Hobbs, Giles Corey, and Mary Warren were all arrested on charges of witchcraft in April. Bridget Bishop was an older woman, widowed, who'd had a tumultuous relationship with both her ex-husbands and inherited land from one of them. She was accused of witchcraft shortly after she became a single, land-owning woman. She was also witty, quick to anger, and outspoken. Giles Corey was an 80-year-old farmer who had a long list of prior accusations on his record, mostly for petty theft, but he'd also beaten one of his workers so badly that he died 10 days later. He'd also been accused of arson by John Proctor, but was found innocent. Despite all this, he was a prosperous landowner in Salem Village and had married Martha Corey, fully aware of her past. I couldn't find much information on the Hobbs family, only that Abigail went from being accused to afflicted quite quickly during her inquest. She accused Reverend George Burroughs, the previous minister of Salem, of being a witch. After this shocking accusation of a reverend, more accusations came forth against people further up the social hierarchy. I'm going to list some of the accused persons and summarize the reasons why they were likely accused. This is a very short summary. If you want more information, many books will be mentioned in this and the next Salem episode. Sarah Wilds, wife of John Wilds of Topsfield, who had land disputes with the Putnams. Topsfield, a village to the north of Salem, was a long-standing rival of Salem Village due to land disputes. The Putnams had fought this battle the hardest, so it's unsurprising that women married to land-holding Topsfield men were accused. It didn't help that the sister of John's deceased wife spread witchcraft rumors about Sarah after they got married so quickly after her death. Mary Easty, the 58-year-old sister of Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Cloyce, was a resident of Topsfield. Her accusation is likely due to both her sisters being accused and all three being involved in landholding in Topsfield. Perhaps due to pressure from the community, Easty was released from jail on May 18th. What happened next supports the idea that a conspiracy was afoot. After Easty's release, Mercy Lewis fell into violent fits and appeared to be approaching death. Mary Walcott, Abigail Williams, and Ann Putnam Jr. were brought to her bedside to discover who was tormenting her. On the way to her house, Anne and Abigail claimed that they saw the specter of Easty tormenting Mercy. Mercy's fits didn't cease until Easty was back in prison. These events strongly suggest the situation was planned ahead of time. Journalist Frances Hill, in her 2002 book, A Delusion of Satan, states that this episode was a propaganda scheme, showing the villagers the consequences of freeing witches from jail. Edward Bishop Jr., stepson of Bridget Bishop and his wife Sarah Wilds Bishop, daughter of Sarah Wilds, were both accused of witchcraft and arrested, probably due to familial ties with two other accused persons. They were arrested after Edward had said publicly that a good beating would have stopped all the fits. They escaped while awaiting trial in October and were never tried. Mary Black, an enslaved woman who worked for the Putnam family. She was accused after Nathaniel Putnam spoke out in defense of Rebecca Nurse, but was released back into his custody after he paid her jail fees. Nathaniel Putnam was very well respected, and Mary Black owned no property, so there was little to be gained by pursuing the matter. It's also likely that the fact that Nathaniel Putnam had taken Mary back showed this accusation was a mistake, an outlier, but fear of retribution may have also been a factor. Mary English and Philip English were the most successful merchants in Salem town. Philip owned a lot of land and was often embroiled in disputes. The English family lived lavishly, didn't farm, and were previously Anglican, all things that were against Puritan values. Philip was also becoming politically active just before he was accused. After being accused, they escaped to New York in secret with the help of Governor Phipps, possibly because they were integral to the New England economy. Reverend George Burroughs had served as a minister of Salem Village from 1680 to 1683. He was one of the ministers who had left the village in the years leading up to the trials and had been involved in the village's social conflicts. He had also borrowed money from the Putnam family and left without paying it back. Although he eventually repaid his loan, he was accused, arrested, and brought back to Salem. Many members of Salem Village testified against him, calling him the ringleader of the witches. Susanna Martin, a 67-year-old widow from Amesbury with a previous history of witchcraft accusations. She was also in an ongoing court dispute over her father's will and her inheritance, trying to secure her own future. John Willard, who had been a constable in Salem Village, was accused of witchcraft at the end of April 1692 after refusing to arrest people that he believed were innocent. Anne Pudeator was a 70 to 75-year-old midwife and nurse. She defied the Puritan female gender ideal of meekness and submission by practicing medicine and was in direct competition with the male physicians of the time. Alice Parker was probably the wife of local fisherman John Parker. She had been previously accused and was possibly a good friend of Bridget Bishop. She was accused by Mary Ann Warren, whose mother had died after Alice Parker had quarreled with her. Dr. Roger Toothacker was a 60-year-old farmer and physician who claimed to specialize in detecting and punishing witches. Toothacker was in competition with Dr. William Griggs. His daughter, Martha Emerson, was also arrested, as was her daughter, 9-year-old Margaret. Several of John and Elizabeth Proctor's children were accused as well, including Sarah Proctor, William Proctor, and Benjamin Proctor. Elizabeth Proctor's sister-in-law, Sarah Bassett, was also accused. Martha Carrier was a 42-year-old widow who owned land due to the death of her husband. Her sister was married to Dr. Toothacker. The Afflicted girls accused Martha of leading a witch army, using her occult powers to murder, inflict terrible disease, and of being promised by the devil that she would rule over hell as its queen. Martha vehemently denied these charges and in turn charged her accusers with insanity. Martha's young children were sent to prison with her, apparently in hopes that their confinement would cause her to confess. John Proctor, who was imprisoned with them, wrote to Governor Phipps to report that he had witnessed the children being tortured in jail so that they would confess and implicate their mother. Elizabeth Hart was around 70 years old when she was arrested. She had been brought before the church several times for offensive language, haughtiness, and contempt of authority. Elizabeth Jackson Howe lived in Topsfield with her husband James. The Pearley family of nearby Ipswich accused her after their daughter began having fits 3 years before the trials began, but it was during the trials that Howe was named as the cause. These are just a few of the people who were accused. Around 160 people were questioned and accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. Most were tried, jailed, tried again by grand jury, and jailed again. 19 were executed. On May 10th, Sarah Osborne died in jail awaiting trial. She wouldn't be the last to do so. The accused were held at jails in Salem, Boston, Cambridge, and Ipswich. Conditions were appalling. Dirt floors, dark, damp, and lice-ridden. Prisoners were bound in ropes and chains, subjected to endless examinations by clergymen and magistrates, insulted by the jailers and anyone who came to gawk at them, and fed only meager meals that they had to pay for. The Court of Oyer and Terminer convened in Salem town on June 2, 1692. Court conditions were chaotic during the witch trials. Records include time gaps in which the afflicted girls had thrown themselves to the ground, screamed, and cried out in pain, usually in response to movements made by the accused witch. Bridget Bishop was the first to stand trial by grand jury. On June 8, 1692, she was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to execution. The execution methods in New England were very similar to those used in England, which we discussed in the Tyburn Tree episode. The condemned rode to the execution spot with a minister, who then gave a sermon and encouraged repentance. A crowd gathered to watch the execution, expecting the condemned to demonstrate their penitence. A confession would alleviate the fear of the community surrounding sending an unprepared soul to the next life. Finally, the condemned was hanged by the neck until dead. On June 10th, Bridget Bishop was marched to Proctor's Ledge at Gallows Hill and hanged in front of the whole town. She was the first woman ever to be hanged in Salem. On July 19th, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Wilds were executed. Sarah Good used her last words to proclaim her innocence and curse the presiding clergyman. On August 19th, John Proctor, George Burroughs, George Jacobs Sr., and John Willard were executed. Elizabeth Proctor's execution was postponed due to pregnancy. Giles Corey realized that by law, if an accused person refused to plead, they couldn't be tried. From September 17th to 19th, Corey was subjected to pressing, likely as an attempt to get him to plead guilty. Heavy rocks were placed on a board on top of his body, yet he didn't plead. He asked for more weight. After 2 days, the weight of the stones killed him. He was buried in an unmarked grave. On September 22nd, Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Anne Pudeator, Wilmot Red, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell were hanged. They were the last to be executed for witchcraft. October brought the trials to a grinding halt. Governor Phipps banned the use of spectral evidence in the proceedings. On the 29th, he ordered all arrests to cease, dissolved the court, and released some of the accused. In May, Phipps pardoned all those still in prison and then formally ended the trials. And what became of the afflicted girls? Betty Paris didn't attend the trials. Her parents sent her away to live with family in Sunbury. Abigail, who had accused 57 people of witchcraft, gave her last testimony before the court in early June of 1692. She then disappeared from the historical record. Mary Ann Warren's fate after the trials is also unknown. Mary Walcott married a local man and had 6 children. She died in 1752 at the age of 77. Tituba spent 13 months in jail. Paris refused to pay her jail costs. Someone eventually paid, and her fate after being released is unknown. Ann Putnam Jr., who accused more than 60 people, was the only one of the afflicted to ever offer an apology in 1706. She said she had been deluded by the devil, and that she desired, quote, to lie in the dust and earnestly beg forgiveness from God and from all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow and offense, end quote. There are many theories as to why this situation exploded like it did. Mass psychogenic illness brought on by social change or female oppression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and ergot poisoning have all been suggested. The truth is likely a combination of these, making it difficult to uncover, which is one reason the afflicted and the accused of Salem spark our morbid curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.